Right now,
They
50.
will tackle tough times in
The
California.
economic troubles facing San Diego will be the focus of Mayor Jerry Sanders' annual State of the City
reports
address.
a 60% hike in rapes where either one or both
Will be
people
a long process. UCLA researchers tracked the progress of 50 sarcoma patients using
From the KPBS studios, this is San Diego Week.
Good evening. I'm Amita Sharma. Thanks for joining us. Heroin deaths are on the rise in San Diego. We'll explain the reasons and we'll look at why there's been a drop in illegal immigration from south of the border. Plus, a new effort to help African American students excel in school and the crucial role that bats play in San Diego's ecosystem. That's coming up on San Diego Week, but first, the headlines. Katie Orr joins me from the KPBS News Center. Katie, there's some good news for teachers and students in San Diego's elementary schools.
That's right. San Diego Unified Superintendent Bill Koba announced today the recall of several hundred teachers who had been slated for layoffs. That means class sizes in kindergarten through third grade will not be increased as planned. Koba described the importance of keeping class ratios small in the early grades.
These students are also San Diego's future leaders, workers, entrepreneurs, scientists, and teachers. Giving them the best start is worth it for all of us, and class size is that first priority. It is for all these reasons that our board, our principals, our teachers, our support staff, and the collective school community have demanded this priority restoration. San Diego Unified is a national leader in making small class sizes a top priority. And for our children, we want to remain a leader in this area.
A new analysis of state funding showed the school district will have about $27 million more than anticipated in the coming year. Voters may soon decide whether California will abolish its death penalty. A bill to put the controversial issue before the electorate next year passed its first legislative step yesterday. If signed into law, the bill would put the question on the 2012 ballot. California has 714 inmates on death row, the most in the nation. That's partly due to the extremely long, costly, and mandatory appeals process. Most prisoners on death row are more likely to die of old age than lethal injection. And UC San Diego Chancellor Mary Ann Fox announced this week that she will be resigning effective in June 2012. Fox said she will return to teaching chemistry at the university. She said it was a privilege beyond measure to work for UCSD. She's been at the La Jolla campus for 7 years and presided over $3.2 billion worth of construction projects. But she also oversaw a time of racial tension at UCSD.
Heroin use is making a dangerous comeback. The San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office released its annual report this week of deaths in the county in 2010. Among the findings is that 6 teens died from heroin overdoses last year and 1 from withdrawal. That's more than the combined total in the last decade. Joining me to talk about these sobering statistics is Susan Bauer, Director of San Diego County's Alcohol and Drug Services. So, Susan, 6 teens died of overdoses. How many adults died from heroin use?
70.
And how did heroin make a comeback?
We're really seeing a connection between heroin use and the increase in prescription drug abuse. We're seeing younger people in our treatment programs that are funded by the county coming in because they have a heroin problem, and they got that heroin problem because they started by using prescription drugs. They used prescription drugs for a period of time, and pretty soon their habit made it too expensive to continue. And so they then moved over, or what we call jumped over, to heroin use to continue to get that same feeling and to feed their addiction with the opiate. And so what's concerning is that in 2010, we saw 40% of our admits into the treatment system under the age of 25 saying heroin was their primary problem. Very different than what we've seen in the past when the demographic for heroin users were much older people who had been using for a very long period of time.
I want to backtrack a little bit. You said that these kids are getting into it through prescription drugs. What sorts of prescription drugs are they taking? And how much cheaper is heroin than these drugs?
Primarily, they may start off with Vicodin, move to oxycodone, hydrocodone, and the addiction escalates very, very quickly. So pretty soon, it's costing them literally, it can be costing them hundreds of dollars a day to be feeding their habit because their tolerance, they need more to get the same feeling. When they get to the point where they can't afford it anymore and someone introduces heroin to them as a cheaper alternative, and it is significantly cheaper for them, and it's heroin. So.
And where are these teens getting the heroin, and where is the heroin coming from?
What we hear from our law enforcement partners is there's various places how heroin gets into San Diego, and there always has been different distribution routes for drugs throughout the county, including across the border. But in terms of kids getting a hold of heroin or young adults getting a hold of it, it's in the communities. And they get to know one another. And if they're with a group of kids who are all going to pill parties, and all putting all their pills in a bowl and grabbing whatever's in the bowl and taking it and washing it down with beer at the party, they all know each other, they're all using together, and when they decide to use heroin, it's very easy to find it.
And what spectrum of society are we talking about? Are we talking lower middle class, upper middle class?
We're actually seeing it quite a bit. The problem began where we originally began seeing it was around the North Coast corridor, the Del Mar, the La Jolla, over to the east, Poway, Rancho Bernardo, seeing it in more middle upper class areas of the county. More recently, we've been hearing reports in the East County of increased prescription drug abuse, but really the problem began or was initially identified in that sort of northern coastal area, more upper middle class area.
There was also an increase in the number of methamphetamine deaths.
Yes.
Why?
There was a significant spike in methamphetamine deaths over this past year. We had been seeing over the past 2 to 3 years continual declines in methamphetamine-related deaths, and then this year we saw an increase. We see annual ups and downs around different trends, and with methamphetamine we're very concerned about the ME's data showing an increase this past year. Why? Well, it said in the report that 40 to 60-year-olds, if you're using meth for a very long period of time, combined with aging, it's going to have an impact.
Very quickly, you talked about the increases in the number of people going to treatment centers. What are the treatment options?
There's several treatment options, and I do want to highlight that you can receive treatment regardless of your ability to pay. There is treatment available for people that may not have the financial resources for it. There is residential treatment, that's long-term residential treatment, where they may stay there 4 to 6 months in a very structured environment, or there's outpatient treatment, where you may attend counseling anywhere from 2 hours to 15 hours a week, depending on the individual's need, and be there for 6 or 9 months. But recovery is a lifelong process, and completing treatment after 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months only means that you're continuing your journey in recovery.
Well, the county has a crisis line for people with addiction. That number is 1-800-479-3339. Susan, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us.
Thanks.
For the first time in more than half a century, the net number of illegal immigrants coming to the United States from Mexico is 0. That is, the number of unauthorized Mexicans entering the U.S. equaled the number who left. Here with me to talk about why migration from Mexico is on the decline is Jose Luis Jimenez, social media editor for the KPBS Fronteras desk. Jose, let's take a look at the numbers in the U.S. According to the Pew Hispanic Center last year, there were roughly 100,000 Mexicans in the country illegally. In 2004, it was around 525,000. What are the reasons for the decline?
Well, first of all, economics. The Great Recession here in the United States obviously has caused a lot of jobs to go away. And with less jobs, there's less people coming over because they can't get those jobs. Further, increased border security. As people who've lived here a long time in San Diego used to be able to cross from Tijuana into San Diego very near the border, the ports of entry. Now there's fencing, there's much more security, it's much harder to actually get into the country. And because it is much harder, the cost of paying a coyote to cross over the border has increased substantially too. So there's also that disincentive. Next is lower birth rates in Mexico. According to their census, women averaged about 7 children in the 1970s. That has dropped to about 2 children per woman in the latest census. Obviously, with a lower birth rate, there are eventually going to be less workers entering the job market. And finally, Mexico has done a good job of getting their young people to get higher education. More people are finishing high school, which they call the prepa down there, and more people are going into to study into universities.
Economic development is also a factor. What sort of progress has been made in the economic realm in Mexico in recent years?
Well, again, the Great Recession hit every country in the world pretty hard, but Mexico has actually been coming out of it much better than the United States. For example, last year in 2010, the gross domestic product increased by 5.5%, which is much higher than in the United States. This year it's projected to be over 4%, and in 2012 it's projected to be over 3%. And most of that is being driven by economic development. Basically, they're exporting more, they're producing more goods and exporting more goods across the world. And conversely, because of that economic progress, the people are consuming more goods inside of Mexico.
How new is this shift? It obviously didn't happen overnight. When did we start seeing a decline?
Well, according to research, the decline started occurring in the mid-2000s, and it has been a steady decline in the number of immigrants coming over from Mexico into the United States.
So 6 out of every 10 illegal immigrants in the U.S. are from Mexico. With this decline, if it continues, what is the effect on the U.S. economy? I mean, we're already hearing stories about labor shortages. How dire is it?
It could have a pretty significant effect. For example, especially in the agricultural industry, they are not getting enough laborers to go out into the fields to pick the fruits and vegetables that we all consume. And of course, one of the factors is these farms will go to where the labor is, much the same way that manufacturing left the U.S. Many people are saying this could also happen to our agricultural sector, where we basically will be importing our food. And again, one of the issues, this also dovetails with immigration reform, the big immigration reform debate. And that's why people say we need immigration reform to make sure that we get those workers here that we need.
And that's sort of a flip side argument that we don't hear in this debate, that the fact that we need them here.
Of course.
Which countries are poised to replace Mexican workers if there are extreme shortages?
Well, ironically, in Mexico, they have their own immigration problem, which is basically countries from Central America, especially Guatemala, which they share a border with on the southern end. And many of those immigrants already come through Mexico to get to the United States. So we could see an increase in those immigrants from Central America coming into the United States. But even Mexico is starting to deal with that problem. There was a proposal to build their own border fence on their southern border to keep a lot of these immigrants out, but I'm not sure exactly what state that is in.
Once the U.S. economy recovers, do we expect the number of illegal immigrants to pick up from Mexico, or is this sort of a state of the affairs there just because of the economic development we've seen?
Well, that is the big question. Is this a significant trend, or is it a cycle? Because we've seen this before during previous economic downturns in the U.S. that, as I stated earlier, there are less jobs, so less immigrants come over. But people point to the significant demographic changes within Mexico. Like I said earlier, people are getting more educated, the gross domestic product is growing, and there's less people being born. So there'll be less people in the job market, which it gives the power to employers to negotiate better wages. So there's still a debate going on, but demographic changes within Mexico are making this look much different than in previous years.
Jose, thanks for speaking to us.
Thanks, Mita.
In an economy that gets ever more competitive, San Diego City schools are about to launch a program that aims to offer hope for a more successful future to African American students. They continue to remain at the bottom of academic achievement in San Diego schools. Joining me to talk about the program is Shirley Weber, Executive Director of the San Diego Association of African Educators. She is also professor and chair of the Department of Africana Studies at San Diego State. Shirley, I want to start off with some pretty serious numbers. They're very dismal. Only 33% of African American students were proficient in state math tests in the last school year. In San Diego City schools, the graduation rate for African American students was 79%, compared to the average of 85% for all students and 91% for white students. In addition, discipline and expulsion rates are high among African American students. What explains this?
Well, I think what explains it, obviously, is a lack of focus and interest and emphasis on African American students. And too often, I think most systems have assumed that they will not succeed, and so they've stopped trying in many cases, or just assumed or just taken for granted that this is a standard that we ought to accept. I think much of the research shows that it's not a standard that anyone should ever accept in terms of the achievement of African American children or other children in the district, period. So clearly the district has lost its focus, has stopped looking at the issues that are there, and as a result, the African American community has raised a concern.
Who has failed these kids?
Well, you know, I think it would be easy to say who had failed. I think if they're children, and we don't believe that any of them are biologically deficient in terms of their ability to succeed, then all of us have failed the kids. The community has failed them because we have not been adamant about what we want. The parents have not probably raised as many issues. The school district has a kid 6 and 7 hours of the day and have not made and don't make progress with them. The administrators. So I think when we look at it, all of us have failed, and it's for that reason that we have put together what we think is a somewhat comprehensive plan to put us all back on track to help our children.
And tell me what that plan involves.
Well, the plan involves, it's taken from something called Education as a Civil Right, and it has 4 basic components that deal with administrative and policy issues. It also deals with graduation rates, it deals with gender issues, and it deals with parent involvement. Those are the 4 key elements we think are significant for students to achieve. And what has happened is that we have put together what we think are some benchmarks or some issues that should be raised and things should be achieved, and then as a result of that have worked out a plan in which we can roll this out over the next year and the next couple of years to see some progress for our children.
So part of this plan includes what's called cultural proficiency. Explain that to me.
Well, cultural proficiency really is what should happen for every child in a district. All of our children are different, and you have to understand what it is unique about the children that helps them to succeed or to be successful. Too often, even in our educational program here at State, we don't teach our new teachers about what it is necessary for children to succeed and who the children are that they're dealing with. One of the key issues when I was on the school board had to do around with discipline. People often assume that because African American young boys did not cry when they were confronted with issues and they looked strong, that there was no remorse, when really there was remorse there. But culturally, they've been taught something a little differently. Also, the ways in which we present information. Some children are more interactive in their learning. Those kinds of things are very important, and we hope to be able to share that with teachers and principals.
There have been programs in the past that have targeted African American students, and they have fallen by the wayside. How do you make sure that this program doesn't meet the same fate?
Well, I think the fact that, first of all, this is the first time that we've had a program that really has involved many of the key agencies in the community that have said Urban League, NAACP, National Council of Negro Women, the educators, a host of individuals who've come together and who've made a commitment to make sure this program works. So the task is up to us to hold the district and the administrators accountable for the program.
Now, African American students aren't the only students in the district who are lagging behind. Does any part of this program address those students?
It really does not, but in many ways it addresses every student, because generally when we found in the past, when you focus on one student and you become sensitive to their needs, it creates a sensitivity to all children's needs. And any program in the past that has actually raised the achievement of African Americans has raised all achievement. But we're talking about accelerating that achievement, because if we make 5% progress and everybody else makes 5%, there's still a huge gap. So we've got to do more than the 5%.
Very quickly, how do you assess the success of this program?
The success of this program will be assessed in the achievement level of our students, the scores, the tests, the fact that we do the A through G requirement. It's going to be an academic assessment. It's not, do they feel better? You know, is everybody happy? It's going to be, are they succeeding, and have we closed this gap between African Americans and whites in this district?
Shirley Weber, thank you so much for speaking to us.
You're welcome.
Bring up the subject of bats, and most people cringe. The flying mammals are shrouded in mystery and fear. But a bat survey project at the San Diego Natural History Museum is confirming what many scientists have long known, that the nocturnal creatures have a positive effect on San Diego's environment. Joining me to talk about the project is Drew Stokes, wildlife biologist with the San Diego Natural History Museum. Drew, let's start with the basics. How many different kinds of bats are in the San Diego County region?
There are 22 species of bats in San Diego County, which makes up about half of what you find in the United States. There's roughly 45 species in the U.S. and about 1,000 found worldwide. So you find about 2% of the bats in the world are found in San Diego County. So San Diego County does have a very diverse population of bats.
So, as we were talking about earlier, a lot of people don't really understand bats. What do you think most people don't know about bats?
There are a number of misconceptions about bats. One of them is that they are flying rodents, and bats are not flying rodents. Bats are actually more closely related to primates than they are rodents. Another one would be that all bats suck blood, and no, most bats do not suck blood. Of the 1,000 species, there are 3 types of bats that suck blood, and 2 of those drink the blood only of birds, and one of them does drink the blood of mammals. But all 3 of those species are found in Latin America, so you don't find them in the United States.
What kind of effect do bats have on our ecosystem?
Bats are actually very beneficial to the ecosystem. They play a number of roles. One of them is they're major pollinators of a lot of plants. So there are a number of bat species that feed on the nectar and pollen and fruit, and in the process they get dusted with pollen. They spread that pollen around the plants. So they are actually very important pollinators, and in fact the tequila industry for a long time depended on bats because they're the major pollinators of the agave from which tequila is made. Another role that bats play is they are major dispersers of seeds in certain environments. So the bats that eat fruit, they eat the fruit, they fly about the landscape and poop out the seeds, and that results in forestation of a lot of areas, particularly islands where they would not have the forest without the bats, because basically the bats are the only vehicle for those seeds to get out to those islands. Pest control is a big role that bats play. Most of the bats in North America eat insects, and so they are major consumers of insects. They control a lot of pests, vehicles of disease such as mosquitoes, and also agricultural pests. And bats actually play a very large role in controlling agricultural pests and save farmers billions of dollars every year in pesticide costs.
So given what you've outlined, how are bats doing? Is there any threat to their survival?
There are a number of threats to bats. Actually, one of the biggest threats to bats and all plants and animals is the loss of habitat. Because there is kind of a fear, misconception of bats, a lot of times bats have been subjected to pest control practices, and so exterminated at the roost sites. But a very large emerging threat is what a fungus called white nose syndrome, which originally was a plant fungus found in Europe that has been introduced into caves on the East Coast, most likely by spelunkers or cavers. And the white nose syndrome has evolved to get onto bats. It gets on bats during hibernation. It forces the bats to wake up, to groom it off of them. It doesn't kill them directly, but it makes them wake up. It makes them deplete their fat reserves. And so you have bats that are starving to death during the winter because they can't find the insect needed to replenish their fat reserves. And that disease has killed over 1 million bats to this date. And so it is emerging as a very, very major wildlife health crisis for bats in North America.
So tell us about the bat research project that you're involved in. What's the purpose of that?
The museum actually has a number of bat research projects going on right now. One of them is what we call the San Jacinto Centennial Resurvey, where we're going out to the San Jacinto Mountains, which are the mountains above Palm Springs, and revisiting sites that were surveyed 100 years ago by 2 famous naturalists, Joseph Grinnell and Harry Swarth. And we are going out to those sites 100 years later to assess wildlife populations, including bats, so we can compare what we find these days to what they found 100 years ago. So that's probably our biggest project. Another project I just recently finished was studying the bats at Camp Pendleton Marine Corps Base. And that was essentially an assessment of the bat population out there. What are the species found out there? What are the habitats they are using? And how can the base best manage and protect their bats while the Marines do what they need to do?
What is your research finding?
That San Diego has a pretty good population of bats. There are a lot of species in the county. Most of them are doing pretty well. There are some species that historically were very common that you do not find these days, that are becoming very rare. And so that would be the most significant finding. And that one of the species is called the pallid bat. And that was a bat that was very common historically in San Diego County, and now that you can hardly find, especially in the coastal areas.
Very quickly now, what led you personally into bat research?
I think like most children, I was always fascinated by bats, and maybe I never grew up. I got my start in bat research here at San Diego State University working under Dr. David Archibald. He was the professor of mammalogy, And he kind of kick-started my research career with bats, let me do an undergraduate project where I started to learn about them, and then put me in contact with the right people who are working with bats.
Drew Stokes, thank you so much for speaking to us about this very fascinating topic.
Thank you for having me.
And now back to Katie Orr with an update on what KPBS is working on for next week.
On Monday, a report about why the city of San Diego and its residents could breathe easier and use less energy if 300,000 more trees were planted. That's on Morning Edition on Monday.
Thanks, Katie. All of the stories you saw tonight can be viewed on our website at kpbs.org/SDweek. And now here's a look at your weekend weather forecast. Thanks for watching and good night.